Hello, everyone, and welcome to Public-Private Partnerships, PPPs, Opportunity and Challenges, part of the Meirc webinar series. My name is Mohammed Nayal. I'm a partner at Meirc, and I am very pleased to share with you today takeaways from my years of experience working as an advisor with public sector entities in the region. This webinar will last about 30 minutes, where I will go over a number of slides. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to type any questions or answers, as I will ask you also questions, into the chat window located at the bottom of your screen as I go along. So let us test the chat screen and see if it works. Can you please type in your favorite color in the chat screen if you can hear me clearly? Okay, I have a response as green. All right, excellent. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you find this webinar informative and interesting. So just a quick summary of my background. I started my education in engineering and transitioned over the years into strategy, where I worked in the financial sector with HSBC America. I also co-founded a startup called Correlation that developed data mining tools, and I worked in consulting with McKinsey. My assignments included projects such as education reform in Bahrain and economic investment policies in Saudi Arabia. After working in the private sector, I spent 7 years working in the governments of Dubai and Abu Dhabi on innovation, technology, and strategy, including working as an advisor in the executive office of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, where I was involved in the launch of various entities and projects. So what will we talk about today? So our agenda will focus on the following. First, I will give a brief overview of PPPs, what they are and what they are not. Next, I will talk about what makes public-private partnerships a success and what can go wrong. And there are many things that can go wrong with a PPP. I will then provide several examples of different PPPs in various industries, and this should take us about 20 to 25 minutes. So what is the definition of a PPP? Now, if we wanted to look at the dictionary or Wikipedia, we'll find many different definitions of PPPs, but we would always go back to the authority on PPPs, and those are generally large NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Typically, the World Bank has a very good definition of a PPP. So according to the World Bank, a private partnership is a long-term contract between a private party and a government entity. This is for providing a public asset or service in which the private party really bears a significant risk and management responsibility. And usually remuneration or the reward is linked to performance. So this is different than outsourcing. So for example, if a ministry decides that it wants to do training and hires a company from outside, that is not necessarily a PPP, that is just a outsourcing contract. So really, in order for it to be PPP, the private party has to bear significant risk and also management responsibility. Now, just to make it clear that many outside organizations, non-governmental organizations, they usually only give countries monetary support if a project that this country is working on is under a PPP contract. And that's why it's actually quite important. So a PPP, we said, is a venture or a partnership between a public and a private entity. And this is usually done to bridge a infrastructure gap. So there's something that's missing. Typically, it's within infrastructure, but it can have also other uses. So you usually pursue a PPP when the involvement of a private partner can significantly improve over what is offered by the public sector, and also, of course, at a profit. So these public-private partnerships can be used to bridge the infrastructure gap. Now, these can be done in many sectors. They can be done in utilities, power, water. They can be done in telecommunications, but they can go to waste removal, bridges, roads, hospitals, stadiums. Even prisons can have a private partnership in them. So what are the objectives of this partnership? So PPPs usually provide a win for the community because what they do is they leverage the strength of both the public sector and the private sector. So usually what you expect out of a PPP is, one, you can maximize the strengths of each sector. You can actually reduce the risk or mitigate it, and the government doesn't have to put up a big capital investment. It also mobilizes different assets, and you would expect that there will be operational efficiencies. And of course, all of this enforces whatever environmental regulations there are and expands the service offering to the community. Now, why would you do a PPP? So there are different drivers for the public sector and the private sector, and there are overall benefits to the community. So for the public sector, what they do is they get access to expertise and resources they don't necessarily have. They also get access to improved efficiency and effectiveness. So overall, if you ask in most countries, they say that the private sector is much better than the public sector at getting things done, and getting things done quickly and efficiently, or more efficiently. And also for the public sector is that they reduce their risk. Now, for the private sector, what do they get out of a PPP? Well, first of all, they get access to things that they couldn't get access to before. So the public sector, if, for example, they partner with the private sector to develop a bridge, well, then the private sector couldn't have done that before. It wasn't available to them. Now, also PPPs are done because these are opportunities to the private sector to show their corporate social responsibility, part of their CSR projects. And also, the private sector can get experience in large infrastructure projects. Now, the community overall benefits if this is done well. You get a wider service offering, enhanced service quality, and prices are usually lower. And then there's reduced risk, and there's a defined accountability. There are many different types of PPPs, of partnerships. Now, we don't have an opportunity to get into each of those, but just so you know, there's something called a service contract, and those are usually typically quite uncomplicated in relations to everything else. So it starts out with a service contract, and that's usually for 1 to 2 years. You then go into more complexity using a management contract, and here the private partner is responsible for managing, not just for servicing. Then you get into things like lease contracts, concessions, things called BOTs, build, operate, transfer, joint ventures, and hybrid arrangements. So these are all different types, and then there are many other things out there, but these are the main types of partnerships. All right, so now that we've given an overview of PPPs and we understand what PPPs are, what are the opportunities and challenges for the private sector and the public sector? Now, overall, the PPP, there are many different things that you have to look at in order to make a PPP successful. So first of all, you need a policy. And this policy needs to put together some clear objectives, principles. And they need to set targets, goals, and how we will achieve those goals. So PPP policy should begin by having a clear economic objective, and have also strong social objectives that are linked to the core values and principles. Now, governments can build the right capacity in a combined approach that establishes new institutions and trains public officials, while at the same time leveraging external expertise. Investors, what they need, on the other hand, is they need predictability, which should be provided with effective legal rules. Proper preparation and execution of the roadmap helps avoid most of the risks that PPPs can fall into. So if you go back and you diagnose and look at failed PPPs in the past, the biggest factor is that there was no proper planning and there was really no commitment, because this is the one that is a major recipe for failure. So some of the most common areas where such pitfalls arise are: one, you don't manage the public's expectations. So usually politicians come out and they promise everything under the sun. And this can put a lot of pressure on the private sector to deliver things that are undeliverable. Also, sometimes the public sector can overcommit and say, I'm going to actually partner with the private sector to develop a metro line in 3 years. And then when it takes 6 years, the public is not happy about it. Or they cannot do enough due diligence when designing the legal contract. And the public sector thinks that this is something simple, and we'll talk about legal contracts and how difficult they are. Or there might be some labor considerations, some key stakeholders, they have some demands, but the public sector doesn't really look into it with due consideration. There are other things also about failing to secure resources and not having enough investment, and also having infrastructure that is incompatible. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong. There are many moving parts, and some of these things can make it a failure. So just looking at a typical PPP contract, for example. So this is drawn up from Her Majesty's Treasury in the UK, and the UK government just publishes a sample PPP contract and says, look, if you want to establish a PPP contract, here's something that you can use, don't need to reinvent it over again. So a lot of people are surprised by the length of this. So if you think about it, a contract can go up to 50 pages, and 50 pages is a lot. So thinking about these, and if you think about how many pages that we have, the actual answer might be surprising. The actual answer is that a typical PPP contract can go over 300 pages. So if you think of a contract that goes over 300 pages, that's actually quite complicated. Now keep in mind that this is just a normal PPP contract and without any special requirements. So you can imagine if there are special requirements, if you're dealing with a consortium of partners, 2 or 3 partners, this can easily go over 400 pages. So if you think of a contract that goes over 400 pages, this cannot be done in a week, and unfortunately cannot be done in a month. And if you're looking at something complicated, this can take a year. So imagine the costs that go over that you can have with establishing just the legal contract by itself. So what are arguments in favor of PPPs? Why should we actually do PPPs? So first of all, PPPs can create competition in a sector where there isn't competition. So usually, typically in the past, airlines used to be just government-owned airlines. And government-owned airlines, the service wasn't great. It was actually cost a lot to travel between one country and the other. and all of these airlines were losing, and the government had to pump in a lot of money. So deregulation came in, and what happened is the government created competition by allowing private companies to come in. Now, that's not a PPP. You don't need to have a PPP in there. If you can open up a sector to competition and you regulate it and you do that well, then all you need to do is privatize. And privatizing is not a PPP. However, you can create some type of competition in certain sectors if you cannot privatize that completely. So PPP contracts can be more flexible than typical public sector arrangements. Now, typically the public sector has less flexibility in hiring, in paying, in firing people. It's difficult to do that in the government. But when you hire the private sector can pay people more, can pay people less, can make people work extra hours. There's so much flexibility that can be done. And then the government gets a choice. It can choose which private provider it wants to work with. And this can be done through an open bidding process. And you can define really the specific quality requirements, and you can include measurable outcomes. And this can be all transparent. So you can all do this transparently, and you get away from people who say, look, the government is fraudulent, it's wasting a lot of money. And that's why the World Bank, if it wants to help a certain country, it says, well, you need to do a PPP, and the PPP should be transparent, open to the public to look at. Now, at the end, the PPP contracts can achieve a level of risk sharing between the government and the private sector. So the government doesn't need to take over all of the risk. All right, so we've talked a little bit about arguments in favor of PPPs, but why shouldn't we do PPPs? So the PPP contracts have a large risk in them. So PPPs can result in privatization, and privatization is not always good because the government loses control over certain public services. And once they're privatized, it's very difficult to bring them back to the government. Now, also the costs of development, bidding, and financing can be too high. So imagine if the government is spending one entire year writing a contract. Now, who's happy when the government spends 1 year writing a contract? Of course, lawyers. They make a lot of fees out of that. So the other side of the coin is that if you don't spend a year developing a good contract, you might end up with a failure of a PPP. So a large contract is required, it's complicated, it takes a lot of money. Now, it could be that some projects end up being politically or socially challenging, and some of them are very difficult to introduce. So for example, one of the strangest PPPs that I have seen is a partnership between the government and the private sector to actually develop a prison. Yes, a prison. So think about the private sector developing and managing a prison. Now, they can do it better, but one of the things that you need to make sure is that they are following all the rules. They are making sure that prisoners are fed, that there's security in that, and how do you do that? So it can be done, but it's quite difficult to do, and you need to make sure that you have clear expectations from both the public sector and the private sector. And in the end, the private sector will just do what it is paid to do and no more than that. Now, the public sector, people who are working in the government, they're usually not paid as well as people in the private sector. Still, they might do things just because they want to do it for the benefit of the community, as opposed to the private sector that will say, look, I'll do what I'm being paid for and nothing more. So those are the risks of the PPPs, and those risks are very real. So let me give you an example. So there was a large-scale project in the 1990s, and in the 1990s, the Labour government was elected, and it was a new government, and it decided that it wanted to do a project, very large scale, cost a lot, with modernizing the London tube system. Now, the London tube system is very old. It started in the late 1800s and has been running for over 100 years. So in 2007, unfortunately, it ended up with a large failure. And who needs to take care of those liabilities? The government. And actually, who pays the government? It's the taxpayers. And the taxpayers ended up with losses that were estimated in the billions of pounds. So PPPs can go bad if you don't pay attention to the details. You need to look at the details. So the contract, who you're working with, and who's taking the risk. All right, so we've spoken about an overview of PPPs. We've looked at the different opportunities and challenges. And now let's give some different examples. So one of the examples, see a lot of PPPs in that, is the operation of public roads and highways. So for example, the US, the United States of America, uses this a lot. So let's say there's a road between two different cities, and that road actually costs quite a bit to maintain. What you could do is you could redevelop this road, maintain it, put a lot of money into it. Or you could ask the private sector to do it for you. Now, of course, the private sector is not only going to do it just out of the kindness of their hearts. So what they do is that they will say, look, we'll do it, but you must allow us to collect tolls. So what happens is the government says, okay, you maintain it for us, you develop it for us, and we will allow you to take $2, for example, from any car that uses this road. Now you could ask, well, what does the public get out of this? Now you have two choices as somebody driving the car. You can drive on a really road and it might take you 5 hours to reach a certain place. Or you could go to a road run by the private sector and pay $2 and actually get there in 3 hours instead of 5. Which one would you prefer? A lot of people would say that we prefer the private road. Yes, we'll pay $2, but at least we get a service out of that. Now that won't work everywhere, but in some places it works quite well. Now another example is in immigration. So there's a big movement towards privatizing visa services. Now in many countries, if you want to apply to a visa to a certain country, let's say before, you would actually have to go to its embassy, wait for hours, do an interview, maybe wait for 2-3 days to get the passport. Now, what some countries have done is they've contracted this out to a private service. And within this private service, you go to a private company, you actually apply for the visa over there, they take all of your biometrics, and typically it is lower cost for both the people who are applying for the visa and for the government also issuing the visa, because the private sector can do it more efficiently. Now, in places like Dubai, for example, if you want to apply for a visa to Saudi Arabia, or you want to apply for a visa to a lot of European countries, you go to this company, it's private sector, you go in, and actually it's much better than things used to be before. So it's a win-win situation. Another example is a PPP in defense, and this happens in the United States quite a bit. So the United States does not develop its own weapons by itself, but what it does is it contracts it out to companies like Boeing, Raytheon, for example, McDonnell Douglas, and it says, I want you to develop a jet for me that has these specifications. Who will do it faster and cheaper? And all these different companies, and of course they have to have very high level of security clearance, they bid for it. And that is one way actually where the army gets better equipment by using the private sector. So that's quickly just a few examples. So let me just go over what we did. We spoke about PPPs, what they are. We spoke about the opportunities, how it can be a win-win situation for both the public sector and the private sector, but we also spoke about the challenges and the risks, and that the public sector who instigates a PPP has to be very, very careful about how it does it. Then we spoke about different examples in different sectors. So I really hope that you found this webinar informative, and if you would like to get more information, learn more about this topic, you or somebody you know, then I would hope that you would consider signing up for our PPP course, and the next one is in November. So you can find out more details on our website at www.meirc.com. This course is 5 days, and of course, we'll be going into much more detail on developing PPPs. So thank you very much, and if you would like to email us at meirc.com, and we will be posting this webinar on our website in case that you'd like to go over it again. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure giving this webinar.
Meirc.com